And now I want to introduce you to Dr. Chloe Carmichael. She is a clinical psychologist and the author of, we're going to get it straight this time, Nervous Energy, Harness the Power of Your Anxiety. She says that while the pandemic's been a source of stress for everyone, if you're a goal oriented person with a to do list and you're an overachiever, you may be experiencing even more anxiety than usual. She has a successful practice in New York City that focuses on relationship issues and stress, helping high achievers. She's on the advisory board for Women's Health magazine and writes an expert blog for Psychology Today. She continues to be a thought leader in anxiety treatment and has launched an online anxiety treatment program called anxietytools.com, which has users from all over the world. Dr. Chloe, welcome. I'm so delighted to see you and be with you.
Paula, the feeling is mutual. I love your work, and it is such a pleasure to be here with you.
Ah, thank you, thank you. So it's been a stressful time for the whole world, really, for the last year. So let's talk a little bit about that. What are some of the things you see that seem to be upping the anxiety level for people in general?
Well, as you said, Paula, I think that many people who are not used to feeling overwhelmed
Hmm.
have been a little overwhelmed in the past year, right? It's been one for the books, so to speak, in terms
Amen.
of, pandemic and everything else, right?
Yes.
So I think that for some people who aren't used to feeling overwhelmed
Hmm.
and maybe who are used to doing healthy things like relying on their social support networks and those
Hmm.
types of things that have been challenged because of the pandemic, they've had almost anxiety about anxiety, where they start saying, oh, gee, I notice I'm feeling stressed. And then they start getting stressed about that, which is part of the reason why I felt that nervous energy harness the power of your anxiety was a helpful message to let people know that anxiety is not always inappropriate. In fact, it has a very healthy function, which is to stimulate preparation behaviors. So that was the message behind it for me.
I love that. Talk a little bit more about preparation behaviors. What exactly is that?
Sure. So I've noticed that a lot of people, when they're feeling anxiety, they'll say things like, "Oh, well, when I feel anxiety, I just take a deep breath and let go."
Hmm.
And sometimes that's helpful, like if you know that you're getting worked up over nothing. But
Hmm.
a lot of times, if we're getting worked up, maybe because we're concerned about feeling that lack of social support, or we're concerned about many other things that have been on people's mind, letting go isn't always the best thing. A lot of times, what actually alleviates anxiety is taking a good, healthy self care behavior or proactive step in preparing. So, for example,
Hmm.
a while ago, several years ago, when the United States was more vulnerable and experiencing more terrorist attacks,
Hmm.
people were having anxiety. And some of the healthy preparations in New York City that they were telling us, where I was living at the time, were like to get your go bag together and things like that. And so I'd be talking to a lot of
Ah.
people that were seeing that they had anxiety, but they hadn't put together their go bag, right? And so when we don't listen to the anxiety and that stimulation, or it could be, you're anxious about a big test that you have coming up.
Hmm.
Instead of sitting there and ruminating about it, my book teaches people how to point that anxiety into a constructive purpose, which is the way that Mother Nature intended it. It gives us a little boost of adrenaline, which can either be used for energy to do something or to ruminate, which is what we don't want to do.
Oh, I just love that. And you know what? I think we will stop right there for a moment, take a quick break, and then let's come back and talk about that because I think the whole concept of ruminating and worry is a very interesting one. So stay with us. We will be right back with Dr. Chloe Carmichael. Welcome back to Change It Up Radio with Paula Shaw. My guest today is Dr. Chloe Carmichael, who is a specialist in dealing with anxiety. So listen up, everybody, because we all deal with anxiety at one time or another. She's also the author of Nervous Energy, Harness the Power of Your Anxiety, which I just love that title because, as I mentioned in the first segment, so many of us think of anxiety as just this negative thing. And Dr. Chloe is going to teach us how to use it to actually handle the normal and the abnormal stress in our lives better. So, Dr. Chloe, you were just talking a bit about ruminating, and I was really fascinated recently to read that the human brain is actually programmed for worry and negative thinking because that was how we survived in primitive times, right? To know the things to watch out for. So, in a way, positivity, which everybody's talking about today, is going against our natural wiring, isn't it?
Well, it is and it isn't. The whole thing is about balance. And that's a really interesting point, Paula. It's true that in our caveman days, if we didn't have the ability to think and worry a little bit about the future, right, we
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't have stayed, prepared for a famine during
Right.
times of bounty. The modern day equivalent is that a person without anxiety would never look both ways before they cross the street, right? So there's definitely actually a very healthy function of anxiety. We just want to make sure that we don't lose the plot, so to speak. A lot of people, when they feel anxiety, they'll actually become self-critical, which breaks my heart because again, they're coming from a good place. There is a
Mhm.
very healthy function of anxiety. So just to use that example from before the break, if you're nervous about a big test, don't just try to yell at yourself, and be mad at yourself for being nervous. And it's
Hmm.
also not necessarily the right move to just be positive and say, well, I'm sure I'll know all the answers, right? Sometimes the
Exactly.
healthy move is to say, wow, I'm having a healthy awareness that I'm not fully prepared for that test. And maybe this restless energy could be put to good use of, say, making flashcards, for example, right? So
Uh-huh.
my book is really just about, it's actually 9 practical techniques to help people connect the dots between their body and mind of that anxious energy and what they can be doing to actually be more productive and less stressed. Because when we point that energy towards good self-care around whatever's making us anxious, we actually end up better off.
So I'm dying to ask you now, what are some of the other tips that you have for taking that energy and using it in a positive way or a productive way?
Sure. Well, just to use a very timely example, I know many people have had kind of a cognitive habit of ruminating or worrying about the pandemic and COVID and everything else, right?
Right.
And now, thank goodness, we have 3 vaccines. Things are starting to, it's time for a new day. But
Yes.
many people are kind of stuck in a cognitive rut. And it's actually an interesting feature of intelligent, driven people that once we get something in our minds, we can almost be like a dog with a bone. We can have a very tenacious mind, right? And
Hmm.
that's not a bad thing. And it's a high functioning mind that tends to take shortcuts and get habits. So if
Ah.
many people just have a habit of, defaulting to stress about the pandemic and they need to change it. A good tool from my book, for example, would be a tool called the mental shortlist, getting a new mental shortlist. And so
Ah.
what we do there is we come up with 5 good topics that we know would be so much better to think about. It could be anything from, some birthday and holiday shopping that you get a jump on, to maybe
Hmm.
mentally practicing a meditation routine that you've been meaning to do, calling a friend that always slips your mind, a
Hmm.
particular work project, really anything. But the idea is that you in advance think about 5 things that you know would be much better for your new mental shortlist. And
Yes.
then when your mind starts defaulting onto worry about the pandemic, which is kind of an outdated topic at this point, that's probably not doing you any good anymore to keep
Mm-hmm.
thinking about, even though at one point it did, which
Right.
is again understandable. There was a time when we developed that habit for a reason. Now we need to give our minds the tools to easily pivot onto a new mental shortlist. So that would be one example from the book to answer your question, Paula.
That's really great. You know, one of the things I've told clients over the years is sort of similar, but it's sort of like have it. Well, back in my day, we had something called a Rolodex, which was like a little rolling thing of cards. A lot of people don't even know about it now, young people. But I would always say the same kind of thing. Have a few pictures in your mind that always make you smile, like puppies, babies, some fabulous moment in your life. You know, sometimes those can really support people as well. But what I love about your short list is it's giving them an action. And when we're in action, that can really help us to avoid that ruminating, stuck place.
Well, that's very true, Paula. So I would also add, to your point about, thinking about positive things, which is
Mm-hmm.
obviously very helpful. The anxious part of us is oftentimes, feeling fulfilled when it feels like it's solving a problem. And
Ah.
so it used to get fulfillment out of solving the problem of figuring out how to be safe during the pandemic. But
Mm-hmm.
now it's kind of chasing its tail around that one. So we
Oh,
want to give it a few other good, healthy problems that we actually need solved now so that
yes.
that part of ourselves can become productive again.
Ah, I love that. So that's why the shopping list, maybe, or for the holidays coming up, or something
Exactly.
else. Ah, I
It's about
love that.
self-care.
Yeah, that's very good. And I think that makes such sense to put us in action rather than because sometimes it's like one of my favorite teachers says, it doesn't help to put a happy face on an empty gas tank. So sometimes trying to visualize something happy, I think, would not be as powerful as what you're suggesting to actually go into a new problem, but not one that creates all that anxiety for you, but one that might actually create joy.
Right. In fact, also it's in addition to being one that, doesn't create anxiety, if the issue still is creating legitimate anxiety, then
Mm-hmm.
we do want to focus on it. But the
Yes.
mental shortlist is good for problems that are actually just residual problems. Like, for example, if you've broke with somebody, you have an ex, you've already talked to death about everything about it, there's no point in reaching out, you've done all your work on it, but you just have this habit of just thinking about the person. Just
Yes.
when it's an old habit and you just want to give yourself a new set of cognitive habits, then the mental shortlist is good. But the mental shortlist is only good if you've truly done all the work you need to do on
Mm,
whatever it is that you're pivoting away from. If there's
yes.
more work to do, then the mental shortlist is just escapism. You need to make sure that you've really done the work, and then you have Dr. Chloe's permission to use the mental shortlist.
I love that. I love that. And it reminds me of when I used to run a grief group. And so often people try to jump to forgiveness before they've really given their inner child, given themselves their day in the sun, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
really worked through the things that were hurtful for them. So I get what you're saying totally. And that makes such good sense. So let me ask you, Dr. Chloe, why do you think so many teenagers are really suffering anxiety disorder over the idea of returning to school? I mean, you would think, on the one hand, that looks like fun. It would be great to get out of the bedroom and back on campus. And yet, so many of them are not feeling that way. Why?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a really good question, Paula. I think that part of it is just because they haven't been in a group setting. It's not just teenagers. A lot of adults as well are very nervous
Yes.
about, even just returning to a group work setting.
Mm-hmm.
And so this, I really love acronyms, right? And so I also love solutions. And one of the little tips that I have currently for people who are dealing with that problem is an acronym called SUN, SUN, with the idea of being that sunlight is the best disinfectant.
Love
And
it.
so the S is for scan. So when we go into a group setting, whether it be a classroom or a boardroom, I want you to scan for 5 signs of social acceptance. That could be eye contact, that could be a smile, it could be open body language, it could be a hello. It doesn't have to be any big thing. In fact, usually when you walk into a room, people are, not jumping up and down. They're just having a normal, subtle greeting. But by
Mm-hmm.
training yourself to just start scanning for 5 signs of social acceptance, that will stop that internal anxious monologue. And the U is for update, because in psychology, we have something called the halo effect, where when we first meet someone, if they make a positive impression, we filter everything through that. Negative impression, we filter everything through that.
Mm-hmm.
Naturally, we all got a negative impression of COVID when we first met it. And we
Right.
thought there were shortages in the grocery stores, shortages of ventilators, everything
Mm-hmm.
else. Some of us are still mentally and emotionally responding to the pandemic as if we're in that stage. So we need to consciously update our minds that we now
Ah,
have 3 vaccines and everything else. The N is to normalize that a little anxiety is understandable. It's when you're doing something you haven't done in a while. It can even actually signify investment and excitement in what's going on around you. So whether it be a
mm.
teenager or an adult, I would invite them to think about the SUN, SUN acronym for scan, update, and normalize.
Oh, I love that. And that's such a great little tool. I love things like acronyms too, because I'm very big on putting tools in people's hands because, as you know, there's a lot of life that goes on in between sessions with us, and people need those tools to help them like a little bit of armor, before they go out into the world. So that's a
Definitely.
beauty.
And if any of your listeners, would like, I actually have a video. I do a series called the Mental Health Minute. So if
Mm-hmm.
anybody wants to like DM me or drop anything in the comment section of Paula's live stream, I would be glad to just share a video of me going through the sun system in more detail.
Oh, that's so wonderful. And while we're at it, Dr. Chloe, why don't you give our listeners your website and, all that critical information because I'm sure people will want to learn more from you.
Sure, thank you. So the easiest thing is the Nervous Energy Book website. So nervousenergybook.com is about my book, Nervous Energy, Harness the Power of Your Anxiety, but that was too long. So just nervousenergybook.com.
Hmm.
Or you can go to drchloe.com/hello. That's drchloe.com/hello, and it will have links to all of my socials. I, do a lot of YouTube videos and everything else.
Fabulous, fabulous. That's really great. One of the things I was really looking forward to asking you because I noticed in your bio that you are also a meditator, that you've even been a yoga instructor. And so, I come from the world of energy psychology. And so we're always working with the energy as well as, the behavior and the more obvious issues. And one of the things I'm very aware of is that whatever we focus on, we feed energy to. And whatever we feed energy to is going to grow. So, how would you use this concept in helping people with anxiety?
Wow, that is a great question. So the reason, so there are 9 techniques in the book,
Mm-hmm.
and the first one is a mindfulness technique. So
Ah,
the book says that the rest of the 8 techniques in the book are kind of optional. It's like a cookbook. You don't have to do them in order, whatever works for you.
mm-hmm.
But I do suggest that people start with the first technique first, because to your point, Paula, what we focus on, is what grows. And so that mindful ability to just listen to the anxiety, to watch it, and not become alarmed by it, but
Mm-hmm.
in fact, learn to dialogue with it. Learn to, ask it like, anxiety, I'm going to stop shouting you down. In fact, I'm going to thank you because you're probably just trying to, flag my attention to something that might be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe we've been going about it the wrong way, like maybe, berating myself or having panic attacks. Maybe that's not so helpful. But I'm not going to stop listening and understanding, what your message is, anxiety. What is it that I need to focus on? And listening to it carefully will actually inform you as to what of the other 8 techniques or maybe other techniques in your own self-care repertoire might be best for you.
That's so cool. And you mentioned a word that I think is a big trigger for so many people. Either they fear it happening or it has happened and now they fear it. Panic attacks. Where do they come from and what on earth can we do about them?
Such an interesting question, Paula. So, as a clinical psychologist and a former yoga teacher, I've really looked at panic attacks from a lot of different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And I will share also this experience that I'm sharing is limited to my experience in private practice working with, what's known as high functioning people, Paula, which I'm guessing is you and probably most of your listeners. So it's people that are basically able to manage their lives,
Uh-huh.
but then yet they find themselves having panic attacks that seem to come out of the blue for
Right.
reasons that they don't fully understand.
Yeah.
And when I talk to people in my office that are having panic attacks, a lot of times they'll say, I don't know what they're about. It just feels like everything is fine. And then out of the blue, I have this panic attack.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times I find that what they need to learn to do is listen to and articulate their anxiety at lower levels. They've actually gotten so good at putting their emotions aside, which is a great skill. Some
Mm-hmm.
people need to learn how to do that. But people, in my personal experience with panic attacks, are often people that have gotten too good at that. So they'll be dealing with really weird, anxiety provoking situations like a boss that's always making snide remarks, or a partner who doesn't show up and who's unreliable, but
Mm-hmm.
they're going through those daily experiences and just saying, it's okay, I can handle it. And it's
Pushing it
true.
down, huh?
Yeah,
Pushing it
they
down.
they can handle it. But the
Mm-hmm.
question is, just because you can handle it doesn't mean you should handle it, right?
Yes.
And so when they give
Yes.
themselves permission to start connecting with what's bothering them when it's at lower levels, a lot of times the panic attacks will subside. That said, I personally had a panic attack on national television,
Oh
and I
my
did
gosh.
use an anxiety technique from my book to help me with it. I was being interviewed on the Nancy Grace show. I had had too much coffee. I was
Uh-huh.
talking about a gruesome murder, as often happens on the Nancy Grace show. And I'm sure that just kind of contributed to it.
Mm-hmm.
And I mispronounced a word and started to freak out. And next thing I knew, I was having this panic attack and
Oh
kind of
gosh.
but what I did is I did this technique from the book, and it's actually that first technique. It's a mindfulness technique that's blended with a breathing technique, and I, trains you to get that oxygen into your body
Yes.
and clear your mind and reconnect with yourself. And if you watch the clip, which I may share one day, you can
Mm-hmm.
actually see where it's like you can see me squirming, and then all of a sudden I go, and then I just come back to life. So,
Wow.
I think breathing is a big one. Also in the book, I talk about anchoring statements because in panic attacks, we often actually lose our ability to think in language. And that in
Mm-hmm.
itself is very unnerving for people,
Oh
especially
yes.
high functioning, intelligent people.
Mm-hmm.
So, anchoring statements is another technique in the book for people who know they tend to get into that panic attack space. And it guides them to come up with some really specific pre crafted statements that are so simple that they would bore you to tears in your normal life. But during a panic attack moment, there are just the nice, simple, straightforward statements you need to restart the language part of your brain.
One of the things that occurs to me is that one of the reasons anxiety is such a problem for people is because they fear it. They feel helpless with it. And I think, Dr. Chloe, what you've done with the 9 steps, the 9 tips that you give in your book, is you found a way to help people get more friendly with their anxiety and drop the fear, which I'm sure in itself is helpful, because whatever we fear is usually something we don't understand, we don't know, and knowledge overcomes fear. Tools overcome fear because we feel a little bit more capable, we're empowered. And so I love what you've done, and I can't say enough times, I think all of us need a copy of Nervous Energy. And so if you would, one more time, you definitely have to come back because this time flew by way too quickly, but would you give our listeners your contact info?
Absolutely. The easiest thing to do is if you just want the book, I was quite insistent with the publisher that it had to also be an audiobook, because I think a lot of times people just need to hear someone talking them through. So you can go to Amazon and get it
Yes.
on, paper, Kindle, or Audible.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you go to nervousenergybook.com, there's a video of me doing that breathing technique I mentioned,
Oh,
and all
great.
my social handles are linked through there. So either Amazon for Nervous Energy, Harness the Power of Your Anxiety, or nervousenergybook.com.
Beautiful. Dr. Chloe, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been wonderful information, really, really valuable information. And I definitely will be arranging with you to come back, because I think we can do a whole show on the anxiety that teenagers are going through, for example, or like we talked about, performers, or all of us have to perform on some level in our lives, don't we? Whether it's in your job, or, if your profession requires you to speak or sing or draw or whatever else you do. There's so many things we can talk about. So I look forward to you coming back on the show again. And thank you, thank you, thank you so much for all you contributed today.
Pleasure is mine, Paula. It's an honor to be with you.
Thank you. And thank you to my listeners for being with us today. Remember, you can find Change It Up Radio, the podcast, on every major podcast platform. We have an Instagram page, we have a Facebook page, and we have a YouTube channel. So please find us, subscribe. We love reviews, and tell your friends about our show. All righty. Thanks for joining us. See you again next week. Bye-bye.